Please subscribe to the channel to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. My name is James, and I'm a wanderer. Not the aimless kind, though some might see it that way. I have a purpose, a drive. I seek out the forgotten corners of the world, the places where the maps fade and the stories begin. I crave adventure, the thrill of the unknown, the chance to stumble upon something truly extraordinary. It was this thirst that led me to Armenvania. Armenvania. Even the name sounded like a whisper from a forgotten age. It was a remote village, nestled deep within, a valley shrouded in mist and surrounded by ancient, forbidding forests. The kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten. A place where the modern world held no sway. I'd been traveling for weeks, my boots worn, my clothes dusty, my body weary. I'd followed rumors, whispers of strange occurrences, of a village cut off from the world, of a place where the old ways still held sway. I was drawn to it, like a moth to a flickering flame. The journey had been arduous, the road winding and treacherous, the landscape growing increasingly bleak with each passing mile. The air grew heavy, the sky a perpetual twilight, even at midday. The trees loomed over me, their branches gnarled and twisted like the limbs of ancient, slumbering giants. As I approached the village, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the landscape. In a swirling gray embrace, visibility dropped to near zero, and I could barely make out the outline of the road ahead. I slowed my pace, my senses on high alert, my hand resting on the worn leather of my travel bag. And then, I saw it, a light, flickering in the distance, a beacon in the oppressive gloom. It was a faint, ethereal glow, like a will-o'-the-wisp, beckoning me forward. I followed the light, my heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. As I drew closer, the fog began to thin, revealing the source of the illumination. It was a mansion, a vast, imposing structure that perched atop a hill overlooking the village. It was a castle, really, with towering walls, arched windows, and a sense of ancient grandeur that seemed to defy the passage of time. Viridian Castle, as I would later learn. The building was constructed of dark, weathered stone, and its architecture was a strange mix of styles, as if it had been built and rebuilt over centuries, each generation adding its own touch to the already imposing structure. Gargoyles, their features eroded by time and weather, leered down from the rooftops, their stone eyes seeming to follow my every move. Despite its age, the mansion was clearly inhabited. Light spilled from several of the windows, casting a warm, inviting glow onto the misty landscape. Smoke curled from a chimney, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else. Something indefinable, that made my stomach rumble with hunger. I was tired, hungry, and soaked to the bone. The sight of the mansion, with its promise of warmth and shelter, was too tempting to resist. I approached the main gate, a massive wrought iron affair that stood open, as if inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, a sense of unease prickling at the back of my neck. There was something unsettling about the place, something that made me want to turn back. But the thought of spending another night in the cold, damp fog was enough to overcome my apprehension. I took a deep breath and stepped through the gate. I walked up the long, winding driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The fog swirled around me, creating an eerie, almost dreamlike atmosphere. I felt as if I were stepping into another world, a world of shadows and secrets. I reached the front door, a massive oak affair studded with iron. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could make contact with the wood, the door swung open, revealing a woman standing in the warm, inviting glow of the interior. She was tall and slender, with long, dark hair that framed a pale, strikingly beautiful face. Her eyes, a deep, piercing blue, seemed to see right through me. She wore a long, flowing gown of dark velvet, and there was an air of elegance and authority about her that was both captivating and intimidating. "Good evening," she said, her voice a soft, melodious whisper. "You look lost, traveler. Are you in need of assistance?" "I am," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I was hoping to find shelter for the night." "The fog." "Of course," she said, interrupting me with a gentle smile. Come in, come in. You must be freezing." She stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped across the threshold into the warmth and light of the mansion. The interior was as grand and imposing as the exterior. A vast entrance hall, with a high vaulted ceiling, stretched before me. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries and portraits, their subjects staring down at me with expressions that were both curious and unsettling. The air was warm and inviting, scented with wood smoke, incense, and something else, something that made my mouth water. It was the smell of food, rich and savory. A welcome change from the stale bread and dried meat that I had been living on for the past few weeks. "My name is Isabella," the woman said, closing the door behind me. "And this is my home. You are welcome to stay here for as long as you need." "Thank you," I said, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. "I'm James." "A pleasure to meet you, James," she said, her smile widening. "Come, let me introduce you to my family." She led me through the entrance hall, into a large, opulent dining room. A long wooden table, laden with food, dominated the center of the room. A fire crackled merrily in a massive hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the scene. Seated at the table were 3 other figures. A man, tall and imposing, with dark hair and piercing eyes, sat at the head of the table. He was dressed in a dark, formal suit, and there was an air of authority about him that was almost palpable. Beside him sat a young man, who looked to be in his late teens or early 20s. He was strikingly handsome, with pale skin, dark hair, and eyes that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. He was dressed in a similar style to the older man, but his clothes seemed to hang loosely on his slender frame. And then there was her. Seated across from the young man was a young woman who looked to be around my age. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with long, flowing black hair, pale skin, and eyes that were the color of the deepest twilight. She wore a simple, elegant gown of dark blue, and there was an air of quiet grace about her that immediately captivated me. "James," Isabella said, gesturing towards the others. "This is my husband, Victor, and our children, Dorian and Celia." Victor rose from his chair and extended his hand. His grip was firm and strong, and his eyes seemed to bore into mine. "Welcome to our home, James," he said, his voice deep and resonant. Dorian nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. But Celia smiled, a warm, welcoming smile that made my heart skip a beat. "It's a pleasure to meet you, James," she said, her voice soft and melodious. I found myself drawn to her, captivated by her beauty, her grace, her gentle demeanor. There was something about her, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on, that made me want to know more. We sat down to dinner, and I was treated to a feast the likes of which I had never experienced before. Roast meats, savory stews, fresh bread, and a variety of exotic fruits and vegetables. It was a welcome change from my usual meager fare, and I ate with gusto. The conversation was lively and engaging. Isabella and Victor were gracious hosts, asking me about my travels, my interests, my background. Dorian remained mostly silent, but Celia engaged me in conversation, her questions intelligent and insightful, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Found myself talking to her for hours, sharing stories of my adventures, my hopes, my dreams. She listened intently, her gaze never leaving mine, and I felt a connection with her that I had never experienced with anyone else before. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice some strange things. The way Victor and Dorian seemed to avoid looking directly at me, their eyes darting around the room as if they were searching for something. The way Isabella's smile seemed to falter at times, replaced by a fleeting expression of what? Fear? Apprehension? And then there were the mirrors. The dining room was adorned with several large, ornate mirrors, but I noticed that none of the family members were reflected in them. It was as if they were invisible to the glass, their images simply not there. Tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. Something was not right. Something was very, very wrong. As I finished my meal, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. The long journey, the strange atmosphere, the unsettling feeling that something was amiss. It all combined to create a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Isabella showed me to a guest room, a large, comfortable chamber with a four-poster bed, a roaring fireplace, and a window that overlooked the misty valley below. "Sleep well, James," she said, her smile returning. "We'll talk more in the morning." I thanked her and closed the door, feeling a sense of relief to be alone. I stripped off my clothes, climbed into the bed, and pulled the heavy covers around me. But as I lay there, in the silence of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was not alone, that the shadows in the corners of the room were not just shadows, that the mystery of Armenvenia and the family who resided in its grand, isolated castle had only just begun, and that I, the unsuspecting outsider, had stumbled into something far more dangerous, far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I woke the next morning to the sound of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a countryside morning, but a heavy, oppressive silence, as if the very air was holding its breath. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the persistent fog that still clung to the valley outside. I rose from the bed, my body stiff and sore from the previous day's travels. I dressed quickly, eager to explore the mansion and its surroundings to try and make sense of the strange feelings I had experienced the night before. The mansion was even more imposing in the daylight. The stone walls seemed to absorb the light, creating a sense of perpetual twilight within the corridors. The heavy wooden doors were all closed, and the windows were draped with thick curtains, blocking out most of the natural light. I wandered through the halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I passed by portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. I saw suits of armor standing guard in alcoves, their metal surfaces gleaming dully in the dim light. I saw tapestries depicting scenes of battles and hunts, their colors faded and their threads worn with age. Everything about the place spoke of age, of history, of secrets hidden within its walls. I tried to open several of the doors, but they were all locked. It was as if the family wanted to keep certain parts of the mansion hidden, off limits to prying eyes. I eventually found my way back to the dining room, where I had shared the meal with the family the previous evening. The table was empty, the remnants of the feast long gone. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was cold and silent. I noticed a door on the far side of the room that I hadn't seen before. It was a small, unassuming door, made of dark wood, and it was slightly ajar. Curiosity overcoming my apprehension, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a library, a vast, circular room filled with shelves upon shelves of books. The shelves reached all the way to the high, domed ceiling, and a spiral staircase led to a balcony that ran around the perimeter of the room. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, a smell that I found both comforting and intoxicating. I was a lover of books, of knowledge, of stories, and the sight of so many volumes filled me with a sense of awe. I began to explore the library, running my fingers along the spines of the books, reading their titles. They were a mix of languages and subjects, from ancient history and philosophy to science and the occult. There were books on alchemy, on astrology, on demonology, on subjects that I had only ever read about in legends and myths. It was clear that the family had a long and varied history, a history that was intertwined with the strange and the esoteric. As I browsed the shelves, I noticed something peculiar. Many of the books were written in languages I didn't recognize, languages that seemed to predate any known civilization, and the symbols that adorned their covers were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were similar to the ones I had seen on the record, and to the birthmark described in the article about the missing people. I pulled one of the books from the shelf, a heavy, leather-bound volume with a strange, metallic clasp. I carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with handwritten text and intricate diagrams. The language was unfamiliar, but the diagrams were clear enough. They depicted circles, lines, and symbols, arranged in patterns that seemed to resonate with something deep within me. It was the same pattern as the inscription on the record, the same pattern as the birthmark, the same pattern as the carvings on the standing stones in Scotland. The lines, they were here too. in this forgotten corner of the world, in this ancient, mysterious mansion. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The mystery was deepening, the connections becoming clearer. The video, the disappearances, the stone circles, the family, the lines, they were all part of the same intricate web, and I was caught in the middle of it. I spent the rest of the morning in the library, poring over the books, trying to decipher their secrets. But the more I learned, the more I realized how little I understood. As the day wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. The silence of the mansion, the absence of the family, the strange symbols and diagrams in the books, it all combined to create a sense of foreboding, a feeling that something was about to happen. I decided to go outside, to get some fresh air, to clear my head. I walked through the gardens, which were overgrown and neglected, the plants twisted and gnarled like the trees in the surrounding forest. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the extent of the mansion's isolation. It stood on a promontory, overlooking the valley, with no other sign of human habitation in sight. The village I had supposedly passed through on my way here was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the mansion existed in its own world, a world cut off from reality. As I walked, I noticed something else. There were no animals, no birds, no squirrels, no insects. Nothing. The silence was complete, unbroken by any sound of life. It was unnatural, unsettling. I returned to the mansion, feeling more uneasy than ever. I found Celia in the drawing room, seated by a window gazing out at the misty landscape. She looked up as I entered, a faint smile gracing her lips. "James," she said, "I was wondering where you were." "I was exploring," I replied. "This place is fascinating." "It is," she agreed, "but it can also be overwhelming." I sat down beside her and we talked for a while. She told me more about her family, about their history, about their life in the mansion. But she was still evasive, still holding something back. I could sense it in her eyes, in her voice, in the way she avoided certain questions. "Celia," I said, "what's going on here? What aren't you telling me?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's complicated," she said. "There are things you wouldn't understand." "Try me," I said. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "We're different, James," she said. "My family, we're not like other people." "Different how?" I asked. She hesitated again, then took a deep breath. "We have a history," she said. "A long and complicated history. A history that is tied to this place, to this mansion, to the lines. The lines. There it was again. The key to the mystery." "What lines?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. But before she could answer, we were interrupted. Victor entered the room, his expression stern, his eyes fixed on me. "James," he said, his voice cold and commanding, "it's time for dinner." I rose from my seat, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. The conversation with Celia had been cut short, the mystery unresolved, and I had a feeling that the evening ahead would be even more unsettling than the day had been. As I followed Victor to the dining room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap, that the family was hiding something dark and dangerous, and that I, the unsuspecting outsider, was about to become a part of their secret. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a noise. A faint scratching sound, coming from the hallway outside my room. I rose from the bed, my heart pounding, and crept to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening intently. The scratching sound continued, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. It was the sound of something not human. I slowly opened the door, peering out into the dimly lit hallway, and then I saw them. Victor and Dorian, their faces contorted in a grotesque snarl, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were moving on all fours, their bodies hunched and twisted, their limbs moving in a way that was both animalistic and terrifying. They were like shadows, moving with an unnatural speed and agility. and they were heading towards my room. Quickly closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. What had I seen? What were they? I knew with a sickening certainty that the family's secret was far darker, far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. And I was trapped, alone, in the heart of their lair. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. Victor and Dorian, they weren't human. Not entirely. The way they moved, the feral gleam in their eyes, the guttural growls. It was the stuff of nightmares. I needed to escape, to get out of the mansion, out of Armenvenia, as far away from this place as possible. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. They were watching me, hunting me. I glanced around the room, searching for a weapon, anything that could offer me some protection. The fireplace poker, heavy and iron, seemed like the best option. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white, the cold metal a small comfort in the face of the unfolding horror. I crept back to the door, pressing my ear against it once more. I could hear them, still out there, their movements now slower, more deliberate, as if they were savoring the hunt. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to make a move. Taking a deep breath, I threw open the door and charged into the hallway, the poker raised above my head. But the hallway was empty. Victor and Dorian were gone. I stood there for a moment, my breath ragged, my eyes darting, around trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Then, I heard it. A soft, rustling sound coming from behind me. I whirled around, the poker raised, ready to strike. But it wasn't Victor or Dorian. It was Celia. She stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was wearing a long white nightgown, and her dark hair fell around her shoulders like a silken curtain. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saw them, didn't you?" I lowered the poker, my relief at seeing her quickly replaced by a renewed sense of dread. "What were they?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "What's going on here?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "It's time you knew the truth," she said. "It's time you knew what we are." She led me to the drawing room, the same room where we had talked earlier that day. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The room felt cold, despite the lingering heat from the hearth. We sat down on a sofa, facing each other. Celia took a deep breath, then began to speak. "My family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not human. Not anymore." "What are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The truth had been staring me in the face, hidden in plain sight, in the missing reflections, in the nocturnal habits, in the strange, unsettling atmosphere of the mansion. "We're vampires," she said, the word hanging in the air like a death knell. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the information. Vampires, creatures of myth, of legend, of nightmare. They weren't real. They couldn't be. But Celia's face, her eyes, her voice, told me that it was true. "I know it's hard to believe," she said, sensing my disbelief. "But it's the truth. We've been this way for centuries, living in the shadows, feeding on blood." The word hung in the air, heavy and repulsive. Blood. The life force, the essence of humanity. And they consumed it. I remembered the strange ritual I had glimpsed earlier. Victor and Dorian hunched over. Something. It hadn't been food they were consuming. It had been blood. How long? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Generations," she replied. "We've lived in this mansion for centuries, isolated from the world, clinging to our ancient ways." "And the disappearances?" I asked, remembering the missing persons case, Alistair Campbell, the rumors that had drawn me to this place. "They were victims," she said, her voice filled with shame. "We need blood to survive, and we can't always control ourselves." Wave of nausea washed over me. The horror of it all, the sheer depravity, was almost too much to bear. "But you're different," I said, looking at Celia, searching for some glimmer of hope, some sign that she wasn't like the others. "I try to be," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "I hate what we are. I hate what we do. I've always longed for something different, something normal." "That's why you were so distant," I said, and she nodded her head, not meeting my eye. "That's why I can be with you during the day. I can't bear to see what happens at night, so Father allows me a few hours, but only a few. And what happens when you can no longer stand to be apart from me, Celia?" She looked up, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "You'll become our next victim," she said. I stared, dumbfounded. I don't understand," I managed to say. "I'm so sorry, James," she said. "I've fallen in love with you, but I know it can't be. You'll die, and I'll be alone once more, forever. Then we need to leave. Now," I said, rising. "We can't," she said. "They'll never let me leave. And now that you know the truth, they'll never let you leave either." "We have to try," I said. "We can't stay here." She hesitated. I could see it in her eyes, the doubt, the fear. And it was then that it clicked. Celia hated what they did, what they were. But there was some sort of bond, a connection. "Why won't you leave with me?" I asked, and her tears began to fall. "I can't. I'm bound to them, to this place, to this life," she said. And I understood. She was too scared, so accustomed to her life, that it would be impossible to start again. "But I'll help you escape," she said. It was the best I could hope for. She told me about the mansion, its secret passages, its hidden exits. She told me about her family's weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. She told me everything I needed to know, to survive. "You have to go now," she said, her voice urgent. "Before they find you, before they feed." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that my chances were slim, but I had to try, for myself, and perhaps for Celia. She led me through the darkened corridors, her hand gripping mine tightly. We moved silently, like shadows, avoiding the main rooms, the places where Victor and Dorian were most likely to be lurking. We reached a small, hidden door, concealed behind a tapestry. Celia pressed a hidden lever, and the door swung open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. "This will lead you to the outside," she said. "Follow it, and you'll be free." I looked at her, my heart aching with a mixture of fear and sadness. I knew that this might be the last time I ever saw her. "Come with me," I pleaded, my voice desperate. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm bound to this place, to my family." "But I began. But she cut me off. "Go, James," she said, her voice firm. "Go before it's too late." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I knew that she was right. I had to go. I stepped through the doorway into the darkness, but before I could disappear, I turned back to her, one last time. "I'll come back for you," I said, my voice filled with a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. "I swear it." She smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile. "Go," she whispered, "and don't look back." And with that, I turned and fled into the darkness, leaving Celia behind, trapped in the shadows of her family's curse. The shadows of the night had revealed their secrets, but the night was far from over, and the hunt had only just begun. The narrow passageway twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, and the only sound was the frantic beat of my own heart. I stumbled through the darkness, my hands outstretched, feeling my way along the cold, damp stone walls. Celia's words echoed in my mind. "Go, and don't look back." But I couldn't help but look back, my thoughts consumed by the image of her standing there, in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears. I had to get back to her. I had to save her. But how? I knew that I couldn't simply run. Victor and Dorian were too fast, too strong. They would catch me before I even reached the edge of the property. I needed a plan, a way to outsmart them, to exploit their weaknesses, to turn their own power against them. As I continued to navigate the passageway, I remembered something Celia had told me. Something about an artifact, an ancient object hidden somewhere within the mansion. She had said that it was the key to their destruction, the only thing that could truly harm them. But she had also said that it was well guarded, protected by traps and secrets. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance I had. I emerged from the passageway into a large underground chamber. It was dimly lit by a few flickering torches, revealing walls lined with shelves filled with strange objects. Jars of preserved specimens, ancient scrolls, and bizarre artifacts that I couldn't even identify. It was a hidden laboratory, a place where the family conducted their experiments, their rituals, their dark and twisted practices. The air was heavy with the scent of chemicals and something else, something metallic and acrid that made my stomach churn. It was the smell of blood. I searched the chamber, my eyes scanning the shelves, the tables, the floor, looking for anything that could be the artifact Celia had mentioned. I found several objects that seemed promising. A silver dagger with a blade, etched with strange symbols, a crystal skull that pulsed with a faint inner light, a wooden box filled with dried herbs and powders, but none of them felt right. None of them resonated with the power that Celia had described. Then, I saw it. Hidden in a corner of the chamber, behind a stack of old crates, was a small, unassuming object. It was a stone, a simple, unpolished piece of rock about the size of my fist, but it was unlike any stone I had ever seen. It was a deep obsidian black, and it seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a small void in the already dim chamber. And it pulsed with a faint, rhythmic energy, a heartbeat that I could feel in my fingertips. This was it. The artifact. The key to destroying the vampires. I reached for the stone, my hand trembling with anticipation. But as my fingers brushed against its surface, I heard a sound behind me. A low growl, followed by the soft thud of footsteps. Whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. Dorian stood there, his eyes glowing with an unnatural red light, his lips pulled back in a feral snarl. He was no longer the reserved, enigmatic young man I had met at dinner. He was a creature of the night, a predator, and I was his prey. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said, his voice a guttural rasp. "This is where we keep our secrets, and now you're going to become one of them." He lunged at me, his movements swift and silent. I dodged his attack, barely avoiding his outstretched claws. I raised the stone, holding it out in front of me like a shield. The moment I did, Dorian recoiled, his eyes widening in fear. "No!" he hissed. "Where did you find that?" The stone was working. It was repelling him, disrupting his power. But I knew it wouldn't last. He would overcome his fear, and he would attack again. I needed to escape, to find Celia, to get out of this place. I turned and ran, fleeing through the chamber, dodging obstacles, ignoring the pain in my lungs, the burning in my muscles. Dorian pursued me, his growls echoing through the chamber, his footsteps gaining on me. I reached the passageway, the same one I had used to enter the chamber. I scrambled through the opening, hoping to lose him in the labyrinthine tunnels. But he was too fast. He was right behind me, his claws reaching for me, his breath hot. On my neck, I stumbled, falling to my knees, the stone slipping from my grasp. It rolled across the floor, coming to rest a few feet away. Dorian pounced, pinning me to the ground, his weight crushing the air from my lungs. His fangs were bared, inches from my throat. "It's over," he hissed. "You're mine." I struggled against him, but it was no use. He was too strong. Then, I heard a voice. "Dorian, stop!" It was Celia. She stood at the entrance to the passageway, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Dorian hesitated, his grip on me loosening slightly. "Celia?" he said, his voice a mixture of confusion and anger. "What are you doing?" "Let him go," she said, her voice firm. "He's not yours to take." "He knows too much," Dorian said. "He has to die." "No," Celia said. "I won't let you." She stepped forward, her hand outstretched. And then I saw it. She was holding the silver dagger, the one I had seen in the laboratory. The one with the blade etched with strange symbols. "I'm sorry, brother," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't let you do this anymore." And with that, she plunged the dagger into Dorian's back. He screamed, a high-pitched, unearthly wail that echoed through the passageway. His body convulsed, then went limp, his eyes losing their unnatural glow. He was dead. Celia stood there, her body shaking, the dagger dripping with blood. She had killed her own brother. To save me. I scrambled to my feet, my body aching, my mind reeling. I picked up the stone, its surface now warm to the touch, and looked at Celia. "We have to go," I said. "Now." She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said. "But where?" "We'll figure it out together," I said. "But first, the rest. We have to kill them." I paused. All of them. She didn't meet my eye, and I could almost hear her swallow. "I know," she said quietly. We returned to the chamber, our hearts pounding, our minds racing. We knew that Victor and Isabella would be looking for us, that they would be even more dangerous than Dorian. But we had a plan. A desperate, dangerous plan. We would use the stone, the artifact, to destroy them, to end their reign of terror, to free Celia from their grasp. It was our only hope, and we were running out of time. The escape plan had become a fight for survival, and the stakes were higher than ever. The mansion was silent, the air thick with anticipation. We moved through the shadows, Celia and I, two figures against a centuries-old evil. The stone pulsed in my hand, a cold, steady beat that mirrored the frantic rhythm of my own heart. We were armed, prepared, but the fear was a living thing coiling in my stomach. We decided to confront Victor and Isabella in the main hall, the grand space where I had first been welcomed into their deceptive home. It felt fitting, a stage set for the final act of this terrifying drama. As we entered the hall, the scene was eerily similar to that first night. The fire was lit, casting long dancing shadows across the tapestries and portraits. But this time, there was no welcoming warmth, no polite conversation, only a chilling stillness. Victor and Isabella stood before the fireplace, their backs to us. They were motionless, like statues carved from the very darkness that surrounded them. "We know you're here," Victor said, his voice low and menacing without turning around. "Dorian is indisposed. You should have run when you had the chance." "It's over, Victor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We know what you are, and we're going to stop you." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You? A mere mortal? You have no idea of the power you're dealing with." Isabella turned, her eyes locking onto mine. They were the same piercing blue I had seen before, but now they were filled with a cold, predatory light. "Celia," she said, her voice a silken whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Come back to us. This is not your path." Celia stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm not yours anymore, Mother," she said. "I choose my own path, and it's not with you." Victor finally turned, his face a mask of fury. "You dare defy us? You dare betray your own blood?" "She's not betraying her blood," I said, stepping forward to stand beside Celia. "She's rejecting a curse you forced upon her." I raised the stone, its obsidian surface reflecting the firelight. Victor's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He recognized it, the artifact of power, the weapon that could destroy him. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice losing some of its composure. "It doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that it's over. You're finished." With a roar, Victor launched himself at us. He moved with incredible speed, a blur of motion that my human eyes could barely follow. Isabella followed close behind, her movements equally swift and deadly. The battle had begun. I held the stone out in front of me, using it as a shield against Victor's attacks. The stone pulsed with energy, deflecting his blows, pushing him back. It was like holding a piece of the void, a force of negation that countered his unnatural strength. Celia, meanwhile, fought Isabella. She had armed herself with the silver dagger, the one she had used to kill Dorian. It was a desperate, unequal fight. Isabella was older, stronger, more experienced, but Celia fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, driven by centuries of suppressed rage and a newfound hope for freedom. I managed to knock Victor back, creating some space between us. He staggered, his face contorted in pain and surprise. The stone was hurting him, weakening him. "You can't win," I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Give up!" He laughed, a chilling, mocking sound. "I am eternal," he said. "You are nothing." He lunged again, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped his attack and brought the stone down on his arm. He screamed, a high-pitched, unearthly wail that echoed through the hall. His arm shriveled, turning black and brittle, as if the very life force was being drained from it. He recoiled, clutching his injured limb, his eyes filled with hatred and pain. Meanwhile, Celia and Isabella were locked in a deadly dance. They moved around the hall, their weapons clashing, their bodies a blur of motion. Isabella managed to disarm Celia, knocking the dagger from her hand. She raised her hand to strike, her fangs bared, ready to deliver the killing blow. "Celia!" I shouted, my voice filled with desperation, but I was too far away. I couldn't reach her in time. Then, something unexpected happened. Celia, unarmed and seemingly defeated, looked up at Isabella, her eyes filled with a strange, unwavering light. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong, and, with that, she reached out and grabbed Isabella's arm. Isabella screamed, a sound of pure agony. Her skin began to smoke, to blister, as if it were being burned by an invisible fire. Celia was using the stone. Somehow she had channeled its power through me, through our connection, and was using it to attack Isabella. Isabella tried to pull away, but Celia held on tight, her grip unwavering. The burning intensified, spreading up Isabella's arm, consuming her body. With a final, deafening shriek, Isabella exploded into a cloud of dust and ash, her form completely disintegrated. Celia collapsed to the floor, exhausted, her body trembling. Victor, seeing his wife destroyed, let out a roar of anguish and rage. He charged at me, his eyes blazing with fury. "You'll pay for this," he screamed. "You'll all pay." He was faster, stronger, more desperate than before. He rained blows down on me, forcing me to retreat, to defend myself with the stone, but I knew I couldn't hold him off forever. I was tiring, my strength waning. I needed to end this. Now, I saw an opening. A brief moment when Victor was off balance. I lunged forward, thrusting the stone towards his chest. The stone connected, sinking into his flesh with a sickening thud. Victor screamed, a long, drawn-out wail that shook the very foundations of the mansion. His body began to convulse, to spasm, to disintegrate. He clawed at the stone, trying to pull it out, but it was too late. The power of the artifact was consuming him, breaking him down, reducing him to nothing. With a final, agonizing cry, he exploded, just like Isabella, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and ash. The silence that followed was deafening. The battle was over. The vampires were dead. I stood there, my body trembling, my lungs burning, the stone still clutched in my hand. I looked around the hall, at the remnants of the fight, at the dust that was slowly settling on the floor. Celia was still, lying on the ground, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. I rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, my heart filled with fear. "Celia," I said, my voice shaking. "Are you all right?" She opened her eyes, a weak smile gracing her lips. "I think so," she whispered. "Just tired." I helped her to her feet, supporting her as she leaned against me. We stood there for a moment, two survivors in the aftermath of a nightmare. Then we heard it, a low rumbling sound, coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very foundations of the mansion. The stone. It was still active, still pulsing with power, and it was affecting the mansion itself. Cracks appeared in the walls, the ceiling began to crumble, and the floor started to shake. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice urgent. "The whole place is coming down." We stumbled towards the entrance, our bodies aching, our minds numb with shock. We reached the front door just as the roof began to collapse. We burst out, into the night, into the cool, misty air, leaving the crumbling mansion behind us. We watched as Viridian Castle, the ancient home of the vampires, collapsed in on itself, a pile of rubble and dust. The curse was broken, the evil was gone, but the cost had been high. We stood there, amidst the swirling mist, the ruins of Viridian Castle, a stark silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. The rumbling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than the previous oppressive quiet of Armenvenia. We were free, the immediate threat gone, but a profound sense of loss and uncertainty hung in the air. Celia leaned against me, her body trembling. I held her close, offering what little comfort I could. We were both exhausted, physically and emotionally drained by the night's events. "It's over," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're gone." "Yes," I said, but the word felt hollow, inadequate. The victory felt pyrrhic, the cost too great. We looked at each other, the first rays of the rising sun beginning to paint the sky with hues of pink and orange. It was a beautiful sight, a stark contrast to the darkness we had just escaped. But even the beauty of the dawn couldn't fully dispel the shadows that clung to us. Celia was free from her family, from their curse, but she was also alone. Centuries of existence, of a twisted, unnatural life, had ended in a single night. She was a vampire, but without a coven, without a purpose, without a past that wasn't stained with blood and horror. And I was an outsider, a wanderer, who had stumbled into a nightmare and somehow survived. I had found adventure, more than I had ever bargained for, and I had found love in the most unexpected of places. But I was also changed, marked by the events of the past few days. The world would never look quite the same. We started to walk, away from the ruins, away from Armenvenia. We didn't have a destination, no plan, just a need to move, to put distance between ourselves and the horrors we had left behind. As we walked, we talked. Celia shared more of her past. Her memories of centuries lived in the shadows of the constant struggle between her humanity and her vampiric nature. She spoke of her family, of their twisted love, of their iron grip on tradition and control. She spoke of her loneliness, her longing for something more, something different, and I listened, offering what comfort I could, sharing my own fears and uncertainties. We were two broken souls, clinging to each other in the aftermath of a storm. We reached the edge of the valley, the fog thinning as we climbed higher. We looked, back at Armenvenia, at the ruins of Viridian Castle, a dark scar on the landscape. "What will you do now?" I asked Celia, the question hanging heavy in the air. She shrugged, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I don't know," she said. "I've never had to think about the future before. It was always predetermined. You're free now," I said. "You can choose your own path." She smiled, a weak, hesitant smile. "It's a daunting prospect," she said, "but also exciting." We continued to walk, reaching a crossroads. One path led back towards civilization, towards the world I knew. The other led deeper into the wilderness, towards the unknown. I stopped, looking at Celia. This was it, the moment of decision. "I can't go back," she said, reading my thoughts. "Not to your world. I'm still what I am. I need blood to survive." The words hung between us, a stark reminder of the gulf that still separated us. She was a vampire, and I was human. Two different species, two different worlds. "But I don't want to be alone," she added, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her pale face, at her twilight eyes, at the vulnerability that lay beneath her centuries of experience. I had fallen in love with her spirit, with her strength, with her resilience, and I knew that I couldn't leave her. "You won't be," I said, taking her hand. "I'll stay with you." A tear traced a path down her cheek. "Are you sure?" she asked. It won't be easy. It will be dangerous. I might. I know, I interrupted. But I'm not afraid. We'll face it together. We stood there, at the crossroads, two figures silhouetted against the rising sun. We had made our choice. We had chosen each other. We turned and walked, not back towards civilization, but towards the wilderness, towards the unknown. We had no map, no plan, just a shared determination to build a new life, a life free from the shadows of the past. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, dangers, uncertainties. Celia would still need blood, and I would have to find a way to provide it without endangering others, without becoming a monster myself. We'd have to be constantly moving to find people willing to sell blood. We will have to find remote regions to stay for periods. But we were together, and that was all that mattered. As we walked, I heard a sound, a faint, distant cry carried on the wind. It was the sound of a wolf howling at the rising sun. It was a sound of wildness, of freedom, of the untamed spirit. It was a sound that echoed the uncertainty of our future, the challenges that lay ahead. But it was also a sound of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, there is always the promise of a new dawn. We walked on, hand in hand, two figures disappearing into the wilderness, leaving behind the ruins of the past, embracing the uncertain future. The end of the night had come, but a new chapter had just begun, a chapter filled with both danger and possibility, with darkness and light, with the enduring power of love in the face of the unknown. And as we walked, I knew that, whatever the future held, we would face it together. The outsider and the vampire, bound by a love that defied the boundaries of life and death, of humanity and monstrosity.